Africans could not vote, but that did not mean that we did not care who won elections. In the white general election of 1948, the ruling United Party, led by General Smuts, then at the height of his international regard, opposed the revived National Party, while Smuts had enlisted South Africa on the side of the Allies in the Second World War. The National Party refused to support Great Britain and publicly sympathized with Nazi Germany. The National Party's campaign centered on the Swat Gevar, the Black Danger, and they fought the election on the twin slogans of Die Kafir ab Siplek, the nigger in his place, and Die Koes, the coolies out of the country. Coolies being the Afrikaner's derogatory term for Indians. The Nationalists, led by Dr. Daniel Malan, a former minister of the Dutch Reformed Church and a newspaper editor, were a party animated by bitterness towards the English, who had treated them as inferiors for decades, and bitterness towards the African, who the nationalists believed was threatening the prosperity and purity of Afrikaner culture. Africans had no loyalty to General Smuts, but we had even less for the National Party. Mellon's platform was known as apartheid. Apartheid was a new term but an old idea. It literally means apartness, and it represented the codification in one oppressive system of all the laws and regulations that had kept Africans in an inferior position to whites for centuries. What had been more or less de facto was to become relentlessly de jure. The often haphazard segregation of the past 300 years was to be consolidated into a monolithic system that was diabolical in its detail, inescapable in its reach, and overwhelming in its power. The premise of apartheid was that whites were superior to Africans, coloureds, and Indians, and the function of it was to entrench white supremacy forever. As the nationalists put it, Die wit man moet elit beswis. The white man must always remain boss. Their platform rested on the term Baskap, literally bossship, a loaded word that stood for white supremacy in all its harshness. The policy was supported by the Dutch Reformed Church, which furnished apartheid with its religious underpinnings by suggesting that Afrikaners were God's chosen people and that blacks were a subservient species. In the Afrikaners' worldview, apartheid and the church went hand in hand. The nationalist victory was the beginning of the end of the domination of the Afrikaner by the Englishman. English would now take second place to Afrikaans as an official language. The nationalist slogan encapsulated their mission: our own people, our own language, our own land. In the distorted cosmology of the Afrikaner, the nationalist victory was like the Israelites' journey to the promised land. This was the fulfillment of God's promise and the justification for their view that South Africa should be a white man's country forever. The victory was a shock. The United Party and General Smuts had beaten the Nazis, and surely they would defeat the National Party. On election day, I attended a meeting in Johannesburg with Oliver Tambo and several others. We barely discussed the question of a nationalist government because we did not expect one. The meeting went on all night, and we emerged at dawn and found a newspaper stall selling the Rand Daily Mail. The nationalists had triumphed. I was stunned and dismayed, but Oliver took a more considered line. I like this, he said. I like this. I could not imagine why. He explained, now we will know exactly who our enemies are and where we stand. Even General Smuts realized the dangers of this harsh ideology, decrying apartheid as a crazy concept born of prejudice and fear. From the moment of the nationalist election, we knew that our land would henceforth be a place of tension and strife. For the first time in South African history, an exclusively Afrikaner party led the government. South Africa belongs to us once more, Mellon proclaimed in his victory speech. That same year, the Youth League outlined its policy in a document written by MDA and issued by the League's executive committee. It was a rallying cry to all patriotic youth to overthrow white domination. We rejected the communist notion that Africans were oppressed primarily as an economic class rather than as a race, adding that we needed to create a powerful national liberation movement under the banner of African nationalism and led by Africans themselves. We advocated the redivision of land on an equitable basis, the abolition of color bars prohibiting Africans from doing skilled work, and the need for free and compulsory education. The document also spotlighted the push and pull between two rival theories of African nationalism, between the more extreme Marcus Garvey inspired Africa for the Africans nationalism and the Africanism of the Youth League, which recognized that South Africa was a multiracial country. I was sympathetic to the ultra-revolutionary stream of African nationalism. I was angry at the white man, not at racialism. While I was not prepared to hurl the white man into the sea, I would have been perfectly happy if he had climbed aboard his steamships and left the continent of his own volition. The Youth League was marginally more friendly to the Indians and the Colorads, stating that Indians, like Africans, were oppressed, but that Indians had India, a mother country that they could look to. The Colorads too were oppressed, but unlike the Indians, had no mother country except Africa. I was prepared to accept Indians and Colorads provided they accepted our policies, but their interests were not identical with ours, and I doubted whether or not they could truly embrace our cause. In short order, Malan began to implement his pernicious program within weeks of coming to power. The nationalist government pardoned Robert Lebrant, the wartime traitor who had organized uprisings in support of Nazi Germany. The government announced their intention to curb the trade union movement and do away with the limited franchises of the Indian Colorad and African peoples. The separate representation of voters will eventually rob the Colorads of their representation in parliament. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act was introduced in 1949 and was followed in rapid succession by the Immorality Act, making sexual relations between white and non-white illegal. The Population and Registration Act labeled all South Africans by race, making color the single most important arbiter of an individual. Malan introduced the Group Areas Act, which he described as the very essence of apartheid, requiring separate urban areas for each racial group. In the past, whites took land by force, now they secured it by legislation. In response to this new and much more powerful threat from the state, the ANC embarked on an unaccustomed and historic path in 1949. It launched a landmark effort to turn itself into a truly mass organization. The Youth League drafted a program of action, the cornerstone of which was a campaign of mass mobilization. At the ANC annual conference in Bloemfontein, the organization adopted the League's program of action, which called for boycotts, strikes, stay-at-homes, passive resistance, protest demonstrations, and other forms of mass action. This was a radical change. The ANC's policy had always been to keep its activities within the law. We in the Youth League had seen the failure of legal and constitutional means to strike at racial oppression. Now the entire organization was set to enter a more activist stage. These changes did not come without internal upheaval. A few weeks before the conference, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and I met Dr. Zuma privately at his home in Sophiatown. We explained that we thought the time had come for mass action along the lines of Gandhi's non-violent protest in India and the 1946 passive resistance campaign, asserting that the ANC had become too docile in the face of oppression. The ANC's leaders, we said, had to be willing to violate the law and if necessary go to prison for their beliefs as Gandhi had. Dr. Zuma was adamantly opposed, claiming that such strategies were premature and would merely give the government an excuse to crush the ANC. Such forms of protest, he said, would eventually take place in South Africa, but at the moment such a step would be fatal. He made it clear that he was a doctor with a wide and prosperous practice that he would not jeopardize by going to prison. We gave Dr. Zuma an ultimatum. We would support him for re-election to the presidency of the ANC provided he supported our proposed program of action. If he would not support our program, we would not support him. Dr. Zuma became heated, accusing us of blackmail and laying down the conditions on which we would vote for him. He told us that we were young and arrogant and treating him without respect. We remonstrated with him, but to no avail. He would not go along with our proposal. He unceremoniously showed us out of his house at 11 p.m. and closed the gate behind him. There were no streetlights in Sofia town and it was a moonless night. All forms of public transport had long since ceased and we lived miles away in Orlando. Oliver remarked that Zuma could at the very least have offered us some transport. Walter was friendly with a family that lived nearby and we prevailed upon them to take us in for the night.